Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Wednesday, June 26, 2024. Aaron Mate joins us now. Aaron, a pleasure, my dear friend. Thank you for joining us. A lot to talk about, including some breaking news from the Pentagon, which we'll wait on for just a minute because I'm dying to ask you this. Is the United States at war with Russia in light of what happened on the beach in Sevastopol on Sunday?
Well, certainly what happened on Sunday is one more step up the escalation ladder. According to Russia, that strike by Ukraine, which killed civilians at a beach, was waged with U.S. assistance, with not just U.S. advisors that help carry out the attacks, but also with a U.S. drone. That's the Russian allegation. I can't confirm that. But overall, I mean, this is the inevitable result of a decision in Washington to use Ukraine to bleed Russia. That's the sole goal. That's the explicit goal of the Biden administration. Lloyd Austin made it plain when he said our goal is to weaken Russia. Jake Sullivan doubled down on that when he said a few months later, this is back in 2022, that our goal is to hand Russia a strategic defeat. So not to defend Ukraine, not to bring this war to an end, but to use Ukraine to inflict pain on Russia. So inevitably, events like this are the result because Ukraine is running out of options. It's desperate. So now it's going after Crimea because it has U.S. supplied weaponry to do so. And whatever the extent of U.S. assistance was in this attack, the question to ask ourselves is this what we want to be doing? Do we want to be rolling the dice with nuclear Armageddon just so that we can take the side of Ukrainian ultra nationalists in Ukraine who couldn't accept the Minsk Accords, who couldn't accept recognizing the rights of Russian-speaking people inside Ukraine, who couldn't accept the idea of Ukraine being permanently neutral, even though that was the goal enshrined in Ukraine's Declaration of State Sovereignty back in 1990. What Russia is asking for there is not some radical Russian proposal. That was actually a Ukrainian principle when Ukraine was founded at the end of the Cold War. And Yanukovych, the leader who was ousted in a U.S.-backed coup, he also moved to change the constitution to enshrine neutrality. So these are not radical demands, but because Washington's goals align with Ukrainian ultranationalists, we are risking Armageddon every single time. And there's no sign in Washington that they're rolling this back. Jake Sullivan initially said that we're only going to give Ukraine permission to use U.S. weapons to strike across the border from Kharkiv. Now they said, actually, you know what? They can strike across the border wherever there's a threat. So what's next on the escalation ladder? It's playing with the unthinkable.
Isn't Ukraine neutrality, wasn't Ukraine neutrality enshrined in the 1.5 inch thick agreement negotiated in Istanbul, poo pooed by the West, recognized and initialed by Vladimir Zelensky's own negotiators, recognized and initialed by President Putin's negotiators? Wasn't neutrality contemplated as recently as March of 2020 until the US and the UK told Zelensky to forget about it?
That's exactly right. In March and April 2022, you had these high-level talks in Istanbul. They made significant progress. Vladimir Putin said that they were very close to an agreement, and as you know, as you mentioned, those provisions were initialed by the Ukrainian side, and then the deal was sabotaged, and it's been sort of a mystery as to why. Well, Ukrainian sources said it's because Boris Johnson came and told Ukraine, we're not going to back you up if you make a deal with Russia. We're not going to offer you the security guarantees that you would need to reach such a deal. You should keep fighting. But in the West, there was basically a vow of silence. The Biden administration said nothing about it, and U.S. media followed. Finally, more than 2 years later, the New York Times recently broke their vow of silence, published, in a really helpful act of journalism, the copies of the full draft treaties that we actually had never seen before. Putin had waved up a copy in June of 2022 in a meeting with African leaders and said that, this was how thick this agreement was. We made so much progress. And then voices in the West said, well, okay, if Putin really has such a document, why doesn't he release it? Well, the document just got released. And to answer that question, the reason why Putin didn't release it is because Putin was still holding out hope that Ukraine would come to its senses and agree to its own agreement, which the West told it not to accept. But obviously that hasn't happened. So now we're finally seeing it from the New York Times. And the Times filled in a lot of details, including more confirmation that U.S. officials oppose this deal. The Times wording is that U.S. officials were alarmed at the deal's terms, and they warned Ukraine against accepting it. One American official said that Ukraine was told that this agreement with Russia would amount to unilateral disarmament. That's what the U.S. told Ukraine, unilateral disarmament. No, it would have meant that Ukraine would have reverted to its Declaration of State Sovereignty, declared neutrality, which makes sense. That's what everyone knows is a solution in Ukraine. When you have a divided country, it's insanity to pull it into one military bloc, whether it's Russian or US led. Just keep it neutral, as so many Ukrainians have wanted for a long time. But because the US could not accept a neutral Ukraine, could not accept the prospect of peace in Ukraine, and therefore a failed opportunity to weaken Russia, more than 2 years later, we still have this awful war.
Let's go back to Sevastopol. Here's the Russian ambassador to the United Nations condemning what happened on June 24th, so 2 days ago. Cut number 10, Chris.
Kiev regime, supported by the USA, and carried out a heinous attack against civilians in the Russian city of Sevastopol in Crimea. Ukraine launched 5 US supplied ATACMS missiles armed with cluster munitions. An American Global Hawk UAV was patrolling the airspace over the Crimean Peninsula. There will be measures in response. The Russian Federation will continue to protect its people and its national security until no threat is posed by the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev that was breeded, raised, and financed by the West.
The neo-Nazi regime in Kiev that was breeded, raised, and financed by the West. Sounds like this finally got to them. Babies, children were killed by cluster bombs, of all things.
Yeah, and what did Zelensky's office do? They celebrated this and declared basically that there were no innocents in Crimea. The words of the advisor to Zelensky, Podolyak, that's his last name, he says, there are not and cannot be any beaches, tourist zones, and other fictitious signs of peaceful life in Crimea. Crimea is definitely a foreign territory occupied by Russia. So that's from the top of the Ukrainian leadership, the guy supported by the US. He's declaring that in all of Crimea, there are no innocents. So everybody is fair game. And ironically, Zelensky's government is the one that says that Crimea is Ukrainian and belongs to us, and the people there want to be a part of Ukraine. Well, how do you reconcile saying that there are no innocents there with saying that the people there want to be a part of Ukraine? In reality, if you believe U.S. government-funded polls, forget what Russia says, the vast majority of Crimeans want to be a part of Russia. They welcome the annexation that happened in 2014. Right. An annexation that only happened because the U.S. helped overthrow a government that was trying to declare neutrality, and Russia faced the prospect of a hostile coup government taking control of its most important naval base in Sevastopol. So how does Zelensky's office react now by declaring that we can hit there wherever we want with U.S. weapons and there are no innocents there? So if they die, tough luck.
It's a reprehensible argument that he makes. Here's a full screen. I will read it. From Foreign Minister Lavrov, who's a lot angrier than the Russian ambassador to the UN. The U.S. is responsible for this massacre, and they will get an answer. All flight missions for American ATACMS missiles are programmed by American specialists based on their own U.S. satellite intelligence data. Therefore, the responsibility for the deliberate missile strike against the civilian population of Sevastopol lies primarily with Washington, which supplied this weapon to Ukraine, as well as with the Kyiv regime from whose territory this strike was launched. Such actions will not go unanswered. Colonel McGregor reports, now I haven't seen anything to corroborate this, but he believes it's so, that when the U.S. ambassador was called in by Lavrov, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, Foreign Minister Lavrov said to him, we are no longer at peace with the United States. Back to the question I asked you when we started. Is the U.S. crazy? Are they trying to U.S., I mean the Biden administration, trying to goad Russia into a bigger, wider war?
I wish I could answer that question. The problem with these people is their policies are so reckless and so dangerous. You do have to question their grip on reality. Why? Why are they playing with these risks? Why are they willing to sacrifice so many young Ukrainians just for the goal of killing young Russians in this delusional belief that somehow Russia is going to break apart and Putin will be overthrown? Which, putting aside the insanity of the goal, practically has it worked? Look at Russia's economy. It's doing pretty well. It hasn't broken. The sanctions have been a failure in terms of their goals. Militarily, Russia still controls 1/5 of Ukraine. It's taking more territory. Ukraine is desperate. They're selling off state assets. It's a nightmare. So you know, I can't get inside their heads as to what could possibly compel them to keep going, except for this fanatical devotion to bleeding their adversary. The U.S. is a hegemon. Russia is a deterrent to U.S. hegemony. It stood up to the U.S. Around the world, in its own neighborhood especially, but also in Syria, where Russia prevented the takeover of Syria by U.S.-backed sectarian death squads. There's a lot of bitterness in Washington still about that. A lot of bitterness in Washington that Russia took Crimea, even though that could have been very predictable after the U.S. backed the coup there. But when you're driven by hegemony and fanaticism, you don't think rationally. And so I don't know what's in the minds of these people, and I shudder to think as to what could come next. I don't think Russia will target U.S. assets. So, say, for example, in Syria, I just don't think they'll do that. I've seen nothing in their behavior that would suggest they would escalate like that. Russia's always been in the business of trying to prevent escalation, I think, with the U.S., given the consequences. But the Biden administration does not have such constraints and is playing with fire.
You think there is probably, well, we know there is if you watch Russian TV, pressure on President Putin from the right, from retired military, from retired intelligence, semi-publicly whispered from current military, certainly from politicians, even from academics. Man, it is time to retaliate. These people hit children on a very religious Russian Orthodox holiday, Pentecost Sunday for the Russian Orthodox, a day that is a national holiday.
Yes, and this pressure that Putin faces is something that Americans are not privy to, because we're told that Putin is this dictator who controls everything, doesn't listen to anybody. He is ultra hawk. He's bent on recreating the Soviet Union. All these fictions
Right.
that are created to justify warmongering against Russia. And in
Have
reality,
you been reading the letters of Lindsey Graham lately? Just busting your chops, but that's what they do believe. You're right. Go ahead, please.
of course, and we don't, and because no one cares about actually studying Russia, and there are very few scholars left willing to speak the truth about it. My late mentor, Stephen F. Cohen, would always point this out, that, inside the Russian political spectrum, Putin is actually relatively moderate. He's been facing pressure for a long time to do something about Ukraine. There were factions in Russia that were very upset. He did not go all the way in 2014. And he agreed to example of the Minsk Accords, which ended the war that broke out after the U.S. backed coup. There are many voices in Russia who thought that was a capitulation, that was weakness, and that basically Russia should have wiped out the Ukrainian army and stopped by force the attacks on the Donbass. Putin tried to give negotiations a chance, and look where that got him. So he does face pressure from the more hawkish elements inside Russia. So far, I think he's held them at bay. But who knows with politics and the way things go? I mean,
Right.
that's why it's so important. And I know many guests on your show make this point a lot. It's so important from our point of view just to do everything we can to minimize the risk. But what's the Biden administration doing? It's maximizing.
Makes me wonder if Joe Biden, somehow thinks it will enhance his reelection if he's a wartime president. If 4 months from now, September or October, there are American troops there and he's rallying everybody around the flag. Boy, he should take a lesson from LBJ and what happened to him in 1968. All right.
Well, Judge, let me say too, another lesson to draw is how escalation happens. Because right now there was a report on CNN this week saying that Biden is considering lifting restrictions on the deployment of U.S. military contractors. And just look at the recent history of Iraq and Afghanistan. When there's a lot of pressure at home to pull back troops from those countries, the Bush and Obama administrations authorized increased deployment of military contractors, which became